Howdys and salutations, y'all, and welcome back to another style study. We're continuing on with Frieren this time. Once again, we will be looking at landscapes for now because we're about to have the holiday pause on here, so there most likely won't be any, well, there definitely won't be any streams next week. Family in town, you know all that, good to spend time with the folks. And, after that, we'll see on the ones after New Year's. I can't vouch for anything. Maybe, but maybe not. So we'll kind of play it by ear, but definitely, if not those, then like second week of January, talking about the 8th and the 9th, we'll definitely be back at it again. Even if I don't stream, I will probably do some more art in the meantime. Maybe, we'll see. So I'll try to post any of that we get. Check out the Tumblr for any news there. I guess I don't really use the Pinterest for roughs so much anymore. I had to learn how to do that, because putting together these little style study bundles might not be a bad tool. Anyway, that's besides the point. Let's talk about what is a style study before we get too far into this. Because a style study is essentially much like those classical master studies you hear about, where you look at the art of one of the old masters, perhaps someone from the Renaissance, or someone even from classical Greece or some such. And you look at and see not just, not trying to mimic their art exactly, but to look at it, to study it, to try to see what makes it tick. Why does it work? And once you understand why it works, how can you apply some of that knowledge back to your own art? But rather than digging into the classical masters, I figured let's look at some more contemporary ones. Because I think every art style has something to offer, at whether highly detailed and grandiose and wonderfully realistic, or like very, very amateur. There's always something you can learn from it. Or at least something you can see in your own art, and tweak your own art based on it. So today we're looking at Frieren, which is just a wonderful story, which is the main reason I picked it, because Frieren's a wonderful story. But it also has a lovely art style. And so we're going to dig into that a little more. Today we're going to be looking at the landscapes. So let me go ahead and pop this out of the way. We don't need this here anymore. And let's kick our reference back on. Because last time we looked at architecture and structures, and actually, why don't we do a quick little peek just to recap where we came from. Hey Kiwi, welcome back! Actually, the one I'd like to open is the thumbnail template, because I did some tweaks after our last stream. Just to add a little character to it, add a little more depth, kind of get the shading a closer match. And again, all of this is real quick and scratchy, but it still gives more of a sense like this feels like a real wall, even with fairly basic lines on it. And if we had a populated scene, it'd be hard to even notice anything that's off. But for the nature scenes, we're looking at an entirely different approach, an entirely different kind of composition. And so we'll dig into that a little more. I'm doing well! Thank you, Kiwi! How are you doing? Let's see. Well, that's something interesting. Well, I will dig into this a little bit, and we won't spend so much time futzing around with the tools and everything this go around. We'll just get right in here. So let us find where we left those leaves. Here we go. Ourselves to a nice brush size. It's really not a bad one. The CSP has some nice brushes built in already, so you can kind of have some fun with these. And kind of get the sense of a tree line with maybe a few... Like, you don't just want it to be flat. There's always going to be a few that stand out. But I also don't think that the tree brush is the strongest option available. There's a few others, like, the grass has colors and stuff you can mess with. These sort of stamps are interesting. Oh, flying rubble. And you can, of course, make custom ones, for better or for worse. Let's see. Ah, yes. Very smooth, curved skyline on this. I'm glad you're doing fine. Raxinella messing with the leaves. But all of that is unimportant, because today we're looking at a very specific brush. Because we're going to look at how this particular artist handles leaves. And I think, for starters, before we do this brush, I'm actually just going to square in a big old quadrant here. Rectangle, there we go. Let's set it to fill only. Let's just grab the bottom half of this and bonk. Move that over a little bit. I guess it really did only fill there. Well, that's fine. Just fill in the remaining gap here. Boom. Okay, just because I think we're going to want a couple different backgrounds to work against, especially in this first scene. In this first scene, I mainly just want to look at the leaves themselves. You can see I've got the sticky notes where I find the pages when I'm planning these. Let's see. Okay, yeah, let's start with the leaves. We can look at the trunk a little bit, but I think we're actually going to want to get the leaves first. And in this one, you'll notice this actually across all of these. The shape of the leaves in this particular style matters a lot less than value and how we're using our lights and our shadows. That's really the key element in the greenery and nature in this art style. And you can see some of that they handle with hatching that you can sort of see kind of in the background, especially behind Fern to make her pop. But a lot of this is just handled with a pretty flat gradient. Obviously, it's screen tones a little bit here just because of the nature of the medium, but generally speaking, I'm going to grab a fairly middle gray. We're going to get to this leaf tool. I'm going to make it just a hair bigger. 250, let's go to 400. Yeah, let's go to the 300. Let's stick with that for now. Opacity 100%. Yeah, okay. And we've got them fairly loose here right now. May want to tighten that up just a little bit. Yeah, I think that's more what we want. Okay, so pressure affects the color on this particular brush. Okay, there we go. That's enough messing with the brush. Let's look at the actual art style. Because you can see what this art style essentially is just layers of light and dark. Almost all of these leaf shapes are basically just the same sort of cluster of vaguely leaf shapes, lots of ovals, lots of ones that sort of look more like a Pringle. So our brush doesn't match that one exactly one-to-one, but it is something we can use as a starting point. And when I talk about those leaf shapes, I mean, you can see them in some of the silhouettes. Like, you get some that are kind of a point out. You see a lot like that. You see a lot that are kind of a freestanding, like, half circle. And then there's lots that are basically not quite an oval, almost always bent, more like a Pringle chip, basically. Let's see. You could even, like, see something like that, and it'd be believable in this sort of pile. But those are some of the basic shapes we're looking at. And you can see in this one, too, we've got similar-ish shapes. Once again, this one's got a little more on the oval side, but it does also have some of the more Pringle-like arcs. Okay, let's save on that. And then I'm just going to throw some of these down here in the back. Maybe I'll go a little smaller for... Yeah, okay, I've got the density too high for that. There we go. This is more what we want. So, once again, we're just kind of getting patches. I kind of wish the opacity didn't change with the pressure. I'd rather have kind of a flat color for matching this particular art style. Because if I press too hard, then we get darker ones, and I don't really want that. And that, I guess, a little more futzing around with the tools. Boopy-doopy-doo. Ink opacity. Nope. No pen pressure adjust. There we go. Now the pen pressure still adjusts. Interesting. Okay. I'm messing with opacity. Is this one of those where it's just got, hold on, brush size, brush shape. Blending mode normal. No, that's fine. Color jitter. I don't want the color jitter. There we go. Just for our purposes, like, color jitter is actually a nice resource to have. It gives a little texture to it, makes it pop. But because we're trying to study how this style handles it, we want to be able to be a little more precise. So I'm going to sort of follow that line of trees over Fern's head, where we've got a few loose leaves, but mostly it's just kind of these loose shapes. And I'm going to basically fill in from here. Like, we'll have some dark gaps in there, but it won't be much. And then it kind of continues on. Then we'll have kind of a separate patch coming down this way. And I'm going to basically just fill in all the way with these. Like, I'm not going to worry too much about that because some of this texture comes from, yes, these little natural gaps are really nice to have. And we want to keep those. But a lot of the texture you're seeing on this layer actually comes from essentially going over it with a a lighter touch, maybe like a lower density even, and a much darker pen. So we get the underside of these leaves, because we've got the light hitting mostly on the top of them, because we're sort of underneath, like standing below them on the forest floor, and it's already a fairly dark night anyway, based on that background. And we get just like kind of these trails in here. And these aren't gaps in the leaves necessarily, they're just some of the other leaves that aren't catching as much light. You get kind of a dense patch in there. It follows along, and it has to follow along because it's giving us the shape of these other patches, so it does need to believably follow along under them. Get kind of more on the underside of this too. You get kind of patchy trails in here, which is very interesting on this style. And I'll deal with the larger one in a second, because we also see just a tiny bit of cross-hatching here. And we won't lean on this too much. In fact, I wouldn't have even bothered with it, except for the fact that it does appear to very distinctly be the same type of cross-hatching we were looking at with this tool earlier. We're just getting a couple of different, like, angles of spikes going on here to give the behind-the-scenes just a little more depth. And a little heavy on some areas there. We'll kind of follow along here. Unfortunately, with this one, it hits a little too dark and harsh, so I don't want to over-cluster it. But some of that will be obscured. Basically, we just want to show that there is still shadow being cast on these because whatever light our characters are currently huddled around, I believe there is a light source that they're huddled around, it's just hard to see in this image. But it's casting light on the underside of this tree, and then not so much on this next one. Like, some of this tree is going to be casting shadow on it, some of that is just going to be shadow below the leaves on the tree behind it. And to catch that difference, to see the tree that is closer to us and better lit, we'll have our leaves, but we are going to have them be a larger brush size. Doesn't have to be massively larger, but it will be a little bit noticeably larger. That's a little too much brighter. We'll tone that down just a little bit. Yeah. And we have sort of this cluster here, which again, we'll get a fairly dense bit going on in here. Kind of these patches. And then we'll give these patches more form when we add the shadows. I still want to leave some of these natural gaps, because again, we want the tools are doing some of the work for us. We want to let them be able to do that. So we're not going to fight against them. We're going to let them have those natural gaps in there, because they add a little bit of that depth and texture without us having to manually go and create all of this. And then we'll go back to our shadow. And once again, we kind of want to keep the same brush size. Possibly, because we want the leaf sizes to match. Once again, these shadows, you sort of have to think of it as the shadows being not cast, but well, I guess in a way cast. So the light is on one end of the leaves, and the shadow is just the backside of those same leaves. So they need to be roughly the same size, or else it's going to be fairly noticeable. However, I do think we may have the size a little bit off in this case. And part of this is our leaf brush here is also just a little bit different. So let's... Is like, I don't want to be too dense, so we may go kind of like a light tap to kind of add these. That way we're not getting the brush's slight over-enthusiasm. And we get like a little more in here. And we don't necessarily, we want this to look more natural, so we're not worrying too much about like capturing precise shapes exactly, but we are paying a lot of attention to where the shadows should be falling. And this is one where drawing from reference will help you a lot. Because you'll actually be able to see trees in all sorts of different arrays and setups. And you'll notice that there's still plenty of shadow in the top. It's not like there isn't darkness up here, but it clusters more in the bottom. Because we have more of the underside of the leaves exposed to our view. You can even see some kind of in the background. Normally you'd have some of this behind them. And then we can go back and get our basically leaf color, maybe just a hair lighter, but I may stick with it as is for now. Once on a much smaller brush, although it doesn't have to be massively smaller. And then I'm just going to go ahead and sort of rough in the tree here. So I may actually get a very big brush and then we'll refine it. Interesting. This particular phenoliner I don't think plays too nice with a brush size this large. But that's okay. And we'll get like kind of a smaller bit there. And I'm not too worried about that looking great because we're going to refine it with our much finer and darker lines and details here to give it that extra bit of texture. So for starters, we're going to see actually a pretty solid black border on it. I may go so far with this one just because the brush itself also clearly, like the previous brush, had a little too much texture. I'll actually deal with that one with the eraser. But the easier way is, not the easier way, the way we're going to do it actually, because I think trying to match this line and then doing the background and everything is going to be kind of a bad use of time. So instead of that, let's actually do a background here. Because we've got a little bit more of these darker leaves, much the same way we have over here. We'll go back to our leaf tool, and we'll keep these to the smaller ones. They're still a little bit further behind, so we want to be able to show that. And this, you can see, it's just a couple of patches. It's where the other tree is kind of visible behind it, but it's mostly vanishing into the shadows. You see this one kind of continues over as well, although Frieren herself is blocking part of that. You can even see some of it in the background there. We'll deal with the layers on that in just a second. And you can see a tiny bit of this hatching in here too. I may make this just a hair smaller and a fair bit darker. I'm curious which hatching tools they're using, because it's definitely not the same ones that I'm using. It's interesting how different an effect they can have. Because theirs are basically like a larger, it's almost like a grid hatch, whereas this is sort of kind of two intersecting grids, so you get a lot of angles, and the ones that we're seeing back there aren't necessarily that way. It's just a straight grid, which is intriguing. But I'm not going to worry too much about that. We're going to go back through with some of these slightly darker, larger leaves, because we want to make sure we're getting the depth right. No, there we go. Okay. Got a few of those there. Once again, you just need to make sure layering, so we need these leaves that are visible in front need to actually be landing somewhat in front of the trunk of the tree, and definitely in front of any of these background leaves where relevant. Like, it doesn't need to continue all the way down that branch, but a little bit. And actually, we're going to see also, I'm going to go for the smaller ones because we're going to see these shadows sort of in here as well, between these branches. So we're not seeing, like, most of that stuff is in the background. It's in shadow, it's away from our light source, so we're not going to see as much of it. I even go for some slightly darker ones in here. Really adding just that little bit of depth. Not going to go too crazy on that. Just want to make sure we have the contrast with the stuff behind. Okay. And now I can go in with our lovely little fine micron pen. A much finer one at that. And kind of get this tree wood texture. And there's sort of two things they focus on. You might be able to tell, in fact, let's zoom in on this a little bit. There is a borderline on this tree. It does blend in with just the texture, but there is a distinct borderline. We saw that in Witch Hat Atelier style too. Just, it gives it that little extra bit of form. Even if you don't consciously notice it, it's really important. And it's a little bit thicker than the other line, so I'm going to go up to a 20. And we'll kind of just get that in there. And we'll want to get that on the other side too. Anywhere where it's actually visible in front, like anywhere the leaves intersect, the leaves are going to be on top, of course. But for this little section, you definitely want to have that slightly heavier borderline. 20 may have been a little much, but I think that's okay for now. And then we get kind of our finer lines. Well, first I'm actually going to clear up any leaves that are overlapping our border here. Just get them out of the way. Get some of these ones, although the end of it is obscured, like the branch leading up to the end is not. Clear out some of these ones too. Just where we shouldn't have that. And now we can get to our darker lines and our slightly finer points. And we can see, let's see, even in small ways, like the tree still has a little bit of shadow and texture where you'd expect it. The sort of front of the tree, the parts that are closer to us, are less dense in the line work. You've got like a couple of sort of scattered lines. And again, they're not all just like perfectly parallel. There's a little bit of texture going on. Some of them are fairly rough lines. And then as we get like a little higher up, we get slightly more continuous because we're vanishing sort of into the shadows up towards the top of the tree. And especially on this side where it's both facing away from us and slightly obscured by the leaves on this branch here, potentially, at least from any higher up light. We get a couple of intersecting ones. We don't want too much overlap on these, certainly a little bit, but mostly they sort of intersect and interrupt each other. Gets us an interesting bark pattern here. Fortunately, we've got Frieren blocking, so I don't have too much context for this front part, but I would suspect it would be matching the sort of lighter colors that we're getting here. And important things whenever you're texturing a surface, just in general, is A, to make sure that you're not leaving your borders blank. It's an easy thing to sort of fill the middle and be like, well, I don't want to run over the edge, and to veer away from it, but it makes it very obvious. It gives a sort of accidental silhouette, as we were even sort of getting with some of these lines. That's sort of general tip. The other one is to make sure, at least with tree patterns, that you're not creating overly parallel lines when you don't need to. Certainly trees often have like long standing parallel barks, but there's often like sort of waves and patterns in here. And so we'll see some of that too as these merge into each other and sort of shift lanes, but especially with the kind of higher density that's coming out of this side. And we see this one has its own. Once again, it's falling more on the darker end of things. And another thing that somehow, it's always amazing to me how easy it is to overlook this. I think it's because we sort of parse it as the color, but the screen tones with this tree are spread enough that they're actually providing a little bit of texture here too. And you can see that we've got it lighter around Frieren's ear. We still have the characters getting silhouetted slightly. That's always good. But we probably want to add something of the screen tone effect, or at the very least a little bit of the shadowy texture there. That said, I don't have any particularly good just like flat speckled screen tones in here. I know there's ways to do it, but I don't have a good brush for it on the spot. I mean, I guess I could go with gauze and make the brush size massive, but it tends to be a little noticeable when you do that. No, don't reset. Let's see. Brush tip, we've got the circle. I'm gonna go random on both of these, give it a little more texture. Okay. I'm not gonna worry about that one too much. The pen settings are really nice in this, and then we'll make this a lot bigger. Not that much bigger, but like significant. And softer, it's kind of a middle gray. And we'll just kind of have this in here. I'm going to do this on a separate layer. Make it a little easier to clean up and manage. And obviously, like, this isn't matching an actual screen tone, would have consistent dots that exactly match the light and shadows that we want, and they'd only be within the bounds that we're looking at. This is going to be a little bit patchier, of course. But it will generally get the job done, and that's all that we're really looking for on this. Clean up the edges here. That's why I did this on a separate layer. And we don't really actually have the Frieren up in front of it. Nor do I think we need to. We'll do like proper face studies and such when we get back from the break, of course, but we can sort of doodle in a quick positioning here. That's already proportionally wild. As we say, like, the first line you do, the angles and proportions don't matter, but every subsequent line have to match it. And I think we made this first line a little bit too long. Just proportionally to the tree. Like this stretch is shorter than this branch is visible. This is angled generally up, doesn't quite come out to the edge of the tree. Interesting sort of ear design. We'll just kind of sketch this in. One thing I do love is every artist does ears differently because they're weirdly flexible. You'd be amazed how much wiggle room you have on ears. I feel like more so than compared to almost any other part of the face, probably because we don't use the ears to identify people nearly as much as we do other facial features. So like, we don't really, like, we're not as tuned or trained to precisely identify when ears look off. And you can use that to your advantage as an artist. Because people won't notice if you do really funky things with the ears. I mean, that's why I think it's the Simpsons creator, what's his name, Matt something, just used his initials as the character's ears. And it's very cleverly done. I mean, you couldn't just blindly do it and sort of be like, yeah. But you'd be surprised how much you can get away with when in terms of just ear silliness. Let's see. I'll be honest, this is also just like a kind of nice break for me. It's much as I always say I like doing landscapes as opposed to characters, that is definitely more so on physical media. Digital art, landscapes are still difficult. We'll have to make this layer a little more visible in the light later. Okay, so angle-wise, we want this to be roughly the same width as that one, coming out slightly further so that this little patch in the bottom, that thicker lines can come through. We've got, here, I'll pull over on the ref just a hair. Got this nice arc up over here. I'm not going to worry about getting too far on the detail with this. So don't let me get carried away with it, because there's other stuff we actually want to do on this style study besides this. Let's see, eyebrow lined up over this, not quite, we're a little off. I think partly this is actually too narrow. I'm going to pull it over a little bit. Get us closer. Always have to do those spot checks while you're drawing. Make sure that your alignment hasn't drifted, because it will drift. It has a way. And we want to kind of make sure that this shape looks right. Kind of right, more of a right angle on the top, this inner curve arced in, and then narrow at the bottom. Not terribly long, but like lower than that one, so I think we're in a pretty good spot there. This one will probably need to be narrower. It's still arcing outwards and then narrower. What kind of has its hatching? I like the kind of triple hatch that we're getting there to give just like a little bit of texture to these. Let's see, this one kind of merges over here. And we get a very similar kind of mirroring. A clean line there. Well, if I can draw a clean line. There we go. The symmetrical hair part. The eyebrow, very subtle. Frieren's expressions are often very subtle, other than when they're very funny, over-the-top, tired, or exasperated. I will say, that is one thing that's very fun in this particular style, is they definitely feel like a different set of expressions than you get in a lot of other manga, like, art and styles. Like, partly, yes, the over-the-top, like, really tired ones, like, they fall within... I'm not saying they've invented brand new, like, language for showing facial expressions, but they're fun and very distinctive in how they do it. And it really works especially on some of the more subtle ones with Frieren. They managed to do a very good job, both of the artists, well, the artist and the author, of capturing Frieren's mood with fairly simple facial expressions. Like, they don't have to show too much to the reader. Because they give us all of the right context where we can get a good sense of how Frieren's feeling. And that's not easily done. Once again, we get very simple, even simpler than in Witch Hat, but these sort of ends on the hair parts, they don't just end on a single point. There's always something in there to sort of spice it up a little bit. And make it, because a point is a little too noticeable, oftentimes. Like, unless you want people to be specifically noticing that point, it comes off as very, like, an intentional thing. When you just have a lone point like that and nothing else in the hair. Whereas if you just want it to be, like, part of a hair thing, then you need it to not look like a single strand. It needs to look like, oh yeah, that's just a natural cluster of hair there. Now let's see, we've got this one coming up. Starting point, roughly level with the other one. Top point, roughly level with where this connects. Sends out a ways. I'm kind of winging the a ways based on all the other lines we've done. Works out slightly and back in. Soft curve in. Settles kind of on top of the cloak part here. Or the top of this sort of scarf or shawl type piece. And this is kind of just a fun way to do like drafty, scratchy characters. Like, I'm not worrying a crazy amount about getting a lot of precision. Like, we will definitely do that when we're doing the proper style study and actually doing the style study of the faces and the facial features, but right now I'm just trying to get kind of the feel and the overall shape of the character. Gives a little context to the scene, and it's a nice little pause from messing around with all the new tools. New to me tools, I should clarify. CSP has had these resources for some time. Got a little bit of shading going on with this one. Just very basic hatching. And then once again, the silhouette around the outside of the character is noticeably darker than any interior lines. Like, silhouettes around individual sort of sections of the hair are pretty bold. We can even see this down here on this one, separating the back hair piece. We get a little bit of the shadow just in the form of a darker silhouette rather than any sort of hatching or actual cast shadows. And these two bold lines here, because this is a bold and sweeping part of the hair. Sweeps out, though, then back in. And we get this side, which is a little more in the shadow too, partly with hatching, and then it eventually just shifts to a full dark fill-in from the shadow of the hair and of the pose. And I got hands in here, which again, I really shouldn't mess with too much because quick sketch hands frequently, they're either the best hands or the worst, and I feel like there's no middle ground. Like when I'm just doing quick doodle hands, they're either like the greatest hands I have ever drawn, or they are just inexcusably terrible. Really fun. Like, genuinely, it's really fun, because I kind of don't know what's going to happen next. It makes it like a lottery of what's going to come out of the pen. I find that as long as I don't aim for making it look too much like an actual, like, fingernail on the sketchy ones, then it's usually pretty decent. I got some of the hair shadows coming out on that side. And then, of course, shoulders, you know. So now we've got a very rough Frieren silhouette at a slightly wrong angle, but it'll do for our purposes here of fitting with the scene, giving a little contrast. Let's see. And it got like a loose line up there, three simple bumps for the lashes there, and then a very gentle arc in, and we actually get screen tones on the eyes, which is interesting. The iris, just a very simple pupil, and then just screen tones in there with the gap in the line and the screen tone to imply the actual like shadow and highlight there. A little tiny bit on the lower side there, but not much. Very basic here. The eyebrows are doing a lot of the expression. Same on this side, really. An arc up, a little bit over. I don't think I've gone quite up. Nope, there we go. I was forgetting about that line. There we go. Comes in not directly at this point, but a little bit to the left of it. And this one actually is sneaking all the way out to this edge. It's interesting that these aren't like perfectly round. Okay, hold on. They're not perfectly boxy either, like I was accidentally doing there. But they're not like perfectly round eyes. They're fairly like long and then an arc at the bottom. I got the pupils in there, very basic, little, very light line there, very light line for the top of the actual, like, eyelid there. Got our little ridges. It comes there. Okay. Then I'm not going to worry about our screen tones too much, I'm just going to do a slightly lighter, well, actually probably ought to do slightly darker. But I need to remember the gap. And likewise on this side, we still have the gap. Okay. And we got ourselves a quick little doodled Frieren. And I do think partly the zooming out, but partly also having the Frieren there for context, I think gives the tree more life than it had alone. Let's see. Oh, do I have a favorite character location? It's hard. I mean, let's see. It's done really well. I mean, Frieren is sort of like the core character. I really like Frieren, just as sort of the way that they can tell the story around her is fascinating, and she's fun. And then Fern is fun, especially sort of the getting to see her grow up alongside Frieren and all of that. Her and Stark both. But no, Frieren's a blast. Just a great deadpan against everyone, like in contrast with everyone else around. Location, though, I really don't. I feel like choosing a favorite location almost feels like the wrong, at least for me, it feels like the wrong way to look at Frieren, because they just pass through places. And certainly they remember them all. It's not like any of them are insignificant, but you don't really stay long enough to, or at least when they're in a location, the focus is always the people. Like, they stay a long time, but they get to know the people. The actual places tend to sort of blur together, which I think is the point. You get that interesting challenge of trying to remember and tracking all of these different places, the significance they used to have along this whole journey, but it's the journey itself, it's not staying in one place. Like, I remember a lot of distinct ones, like when you can go back through and I can, you know, follow in your head, there's lots of different villages, but frequently the villages aren't even given names. Larger towns are given names, and they may stay there for a few chapters. But, like, let's see. Even the larger towns, the events usually happen outside of them. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I really have a favorite location. Part of the joy is that it's almost like, well, I mean, it does make sense. It'd be sort of like a road trip movie where you spend a little time somewhere, you get to know some people, but then you have to move on, and you may or may not see those folks again. It's a little bit bittersweet every time they leave, but it's also nice because you know they'll get to run into another place, and they wouldn't have even found this place if they hadn't have left the previous one. So it's interesting. I enjoy the flow of going from the woods to the towns, and then back to different landscapes, and then back to maybe a small village or a single hut, or maybe a large city. But it's definitely a character-driven manga for sure. Like, Witch Hat puts a lot more emphasis on making extremely dynamic locations, I would say. Witch Hat Atelier. Every place has a very distinct personality because that one is so much more aggressively rooted in the world. All of the magic in that series is based in sort of the world around it, and either the nature there or how the nature has been warped by the people there. But in any case, every location is very distinct, and it feels lived in and thought out in very bold ways. Whereas Frieren, it's a lot more about just appreciating the simple things and wherever you're at. And I do think it shows in the art style, too. Because of where so much of the art's focus isn't necessarily on the backgrounds or the locations, and so much of the writing focus, like, a place may have a little vignette. I mean, again, these are spoiler-free streams, I won't spoil anything. But in Volume 4, they do stop at a place for several months, and do a lot of practice, and various skills is too vague, even. I'll just say it's the one where they practice ballroom dancing. And, like, they spend a lot of time there, and you get to know some characters, and you do know the name of the town. But, like, even then, in the actual manga, it's only a couple of chapters, and then they're back on the road again. And they may well not return to that place. Or they might on their route back. Hard to know. But that doesn't change the fact that you get attached to the characters there and feel you've learned a little bit more about them, and a little bit more about the protagonists. I don't know. I like it. I like it a lot. But as for this, I feel like I'm glad we did the little Frieren doodle here. Even if proportionally it's not not exactly great. Just because it helps give the contrast, and honestly, if I was really doing this justice, I would go ahead and pop another layer in here. Whoop. Pop another layer in here under this, and then just do a very, very quick little, like, brush fill. Grab 100. Grab a really light, not quite white, but close, and just fill in underneath. I'm not even going to do a particularly precise job of it. Just to illustrate for our purposes. But we get this really nice contrast. You sort of have the characters, which have oftentimes very, like, not simplified expressions, but solid and clean lines, not a lot of shading going on the faces here, or on the clothes. Like, there's just some very light, it's either very solid darks or very light whites, there's not a lot of middle, and then the background all sinks into sort of the middle tones. where you get these nice middle grays. There's some dark for the shading because it's a particularly dark moment. If we look at a lighter one, we'll see there's a lot more light in the background because it's a more well-lit spot. But oftentimes, like, the background has a lot more variance than the individual characters do. It allows it to fade into the background so that the characters can pop, which is good. You kind of want the background in the background most of the time. It also shows that even with this, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that that was a very precision-drawn tree. It was pretty haphazard. We just kind of threw leaves wherever. We put some thought into the lines and the shading down here. But frankly, more thought into just the general, like, texture pattern than into the actual, like, lines of the tree itself. And yet, it's still believably a tree. Like, it doesn't draw your eye too much, but when you get out to this distance, if we continued this pattern along, it's believably a tree, you know? For the purposes of what we need it for. So I think it's a nice balance there. But that's not the only one I wanted to look at. So let's throw these into a folder real quick. Woods 1. And let's look at, I mean, we can look at this one, but I think it's actually going to be a lot of the same, except it's just a kind of starker scene. It's a very jarring scene, it's fun. But let's look at this overhead view. And I apologize that every single image is a different color. That's just sort of the nature of taking these photos with my phone and the natural lighting here. Let's look at this one, though. And I'm actually going to adjust the shape of this. We'll have to make our reference image a little better on screen, because I think it may have been falling off the screen a bit anyway. I'm sorry if that was the case. And let's pop this up here entirely. We'll move our canvas over a little bit so that we can see. Oops, there we go. Oh, jeepers, I hope our reference wasn't too far out of the way. If it was, just in case, here are the trees that we were looking at, and here's a little Frieren that I was just quick sketching there, doodling really. So you can sort of see the match here in the style. I'm just capturing the light shadows underneath, having a higher density of shadows on, like, in the, well, the more shaded or darker parts of the tree, lighter, more of the light up near where it's actually catching the light source. And then in the depth, the background is also fading into darker, more distant trees that are further from our light source and just further from us. So as long as you catch those general value movements, you have generally the darker sections are in the right area, the lighter sections are in the right area, and then you've got just a little bit of texture on there, whether it's kind of this generic leaf texture or the generic sort of screen tone we put over the tree down there. As long as you have those two things, you can really get the feel of the background without having to go into the full detail of the background. I am sorry we don't have a better hatching brush. I may have to just do manual hatching next time. Just because, like, it definitely, like, this section didn't turn out as good of a study as I would have liked. I think down here we generally fared better because it was more obscured. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. So let's take a look at this wood line. Now, ignoring the explosion in it, although we shouldn't, but ignoring the explosion in it nonetheless, let's look at what's actually happening with the trees here. And this is where we can get back into one of my favorite things, because it comes up all the time. And, yeah, I just did all of that on that layer, huh? Yep, that's what I thought. Well, that's no matter. But the concept is level of detail. Oh, yep, let me put this, hold on, let me scoot this into a place where it's not going to be too much in the way. There we go. And level of detail is especially important in really large sweeping view scenes like this, because they give us depth extremely well. And I'm actually going to work from the back to the front on this one. Let's see, have we got it all? Yep, okay, that's all in frame. Not really missing anything. Cool. And we're going to work from the back, where it's a much lower level of detail. I mean, and this mountain on this mountain right here on the side, on the left, like, we have almost nothing. Almost nothing in terms of the detail. There's not even the detail of leaves. There's not even really the detail of trees. It's just where the light and dark is hitting. And then there's like a little bit of screen tone or stippling, where, like, to give it a little bit of the tree texture as opposed to just a smooth rock mountain. The nearer mountain that's off to the left of it has a little bit more. You can see what look like brighter, darker patches where there might be some trees that are of different colors or catching the light, or a little bit of different texture where it might be denser or looser of the trees. And then as you get closer, you start to make out a little bit of like individual trees with that one, and then we really start to make out individual leaves as we get to these upcoming ones. And there's one interesting thing, which I don't know that my nice little leaf brush will actually support. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can set this up, just to get a glance at it real quick. Brush tip. Nope, I think it's going to take a little bit more. There's ways to do this. We would just have to customize the brush more than I want to bother doing on this quick little style study stream. But basically, every single leaf has a silhouette that's automatically matching the leaf there. We won't be able to match that one-to-one, but we might be able to replicate the effect somewhat. But it keeps the close-up front leaves looking more detailed. They're a little bit larger than the leaves behind them, and they're more detailed, even though they're still, like, you almost never even have the full silhouette of a single leaf. It's still the overall tree shape. But these ones in the corners down here, they're larger, they're more defined. I mean, this little section of branch here is larger than the entire mountain in the back. And of course, we all know this. We know stuff that's further away looks smaller. But it's still interesting to see how the artist handles it, this level of detail, because it's done very well here. Fairly subtly, too. So I'm going to go ahead and do our quick little background mountain real quick, starting with the much darker ones, which is an interesting approach. Keeps the region looking kind of oppressive and unknown. Oftentimes, stuff in the background in the distance actually looks like a little bit lighter and fades towards blue, just because of, well, scattering of going through air. Air doesn't have quite no color. It's mostly transparent, but there's still a little bit of effect. And if you're looking through enough of it, it does start to tint how you see things. Okay. Hold on, let's get ourselves a nice, big, slightly rougher brush here. And I'm just going to kind of quick sketch in this mountain back here. It gives us a nice little bit of texture. And I will go over this with, like, our sort of stippling brush in a minute. But this way we get just, like, quick high contrast going on here. We have our darker patches, we have some of our lighter patches. And then some of these that really ought to just be done with, like, light lines on the dark rather than trying to leave an open space, so I will go back and add some of those later. And it starts to fade into more distinctive trees as it gets closer. But for the most part, I'm just going to take a fairly big brush to this and not worry too much about the texture. I'm going to fill in a little bit, and I'm not going to worry too much about the bottom here either. Much like when you see a Bob Ross painting and you can tell he's about to go over one section with a whole new color of paint, so you don't have to worry about it too much. That. Except, obviously, my art skills are not Bob Ross levels. I do recommend, though, if you ever want, like, his is a wonderful style to study. Highly recommend. Always interesting insights from watching Bob Ross videos and how he approaches things. Let's see. Yep, I want that part kind of going over. We'll just fill in here. And I've made it a little big, but we're just kind of generally getting ourselves the appearance of this. Go in with the light one and a slightly smaller brush and kind of add in a little bit of these textures, some of these smaller ones, because we start to get at the bottom both befitting of an actual mountain, perhaps, and befitting of the distance being a little closer. We start to see what might be light reflecting on individual trees and the ridges a little bit more. Going down that one, start to get a few individual specks as it kind of starts merging into the larger, or the closer mountain over here, and we get this valley here that appears to be very dense, densely populated with trees and not just the stones. I'll also do just kind of a very gentle, like, again, I'm not trying, in this case, I'm not trying to replicate literally the techniques one-to-one, because they used a lot of very precise, like, gradients and filters that I'm not going to try to match here. Partly because, frankly, I'm not set up for it. As I think is probably fairly obvious with the amount that I've been struggling with some of these, some of the tools. Always helps to practice those before you try to teach other people how to use them. But it's also just because, like, trying to match that one-to-one wouldn't necessarily be useful. The important parts of the style are more of the value and shading and how to use those well. It's sort of the difference between style and technique. Because you could match this style with just a, you know, like a micron pen, if you had the dedication for it. Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, there's a million things to do with balancing the color. Yeah, I appreciate it. Appreciate it, Kiwi. Yeah, I'm not too worried about it, especially since they're just references, so I'm not like trying to do... If I was doing professional photography, I would have spent more than a few minutes like actually photographing them. And adjusting, and I would have, you know, adjusted the color balance and tried to tweak all the different things they have there. Hey, no worries, no worries. Paragraphs are always welcome in this chat. I'm already spending too much time on this one. They would have just... I suspect that the artist did not spend a massive amount of time on that mountain, because they don't need to. It's not... I'm not saying it's a bad mountain when I say that. I'm actually... It's... I realize a lot of the times people feel like you get the sense with art that, like, oh, if you didn't spend much time on it, you were just blasting through it and it's sloppy. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is that they've got a process down, and they've got the tools down to draw these things well, and get the idea across very clearly without having to dedicate hours upon hours to random panel backgrounds, because that's not what you need. Like, the random panel backgrounds, getting these mountains exactly right is really not going to contribute that much to the overall story. Like, having them good is important. You don't want them to be rubbish, but, like, they're once again, you get the values in generally the right places, you've got the lights where they need to be, the darks where they need to be, and the textures right, or the level of detail in this case, whether we've got these individual spots for some of these ones back here, or we have much larger, leaves in the up foreground ones. In either case, those are going to go a lot further than fretting about every little line. So I'm going to just go ahead and kind of fill these in. Just to get some of the dark, not worrying too much, because a lot of this texture can come from, like, this one has much starker, like, I think it is actually genuinely supposed to be more of a rocky mountain, as opposed to the more tree-lined ones we see here with some of the stippling. And I wonder, we might even be able to use, if we're clever with it, and keep the density low, and the particle size large. Yeesh, no, not that one. Okay. Particle density super low. Particle size really high. There we go. Okay, there we go. Maybe like in the 600 range, just to keep the brush more manageable. Now we've got some of these really bright ones here, and then we've got patches that are less bright, but I'm going to try to capture these really, like, dense spots first. Just following where the light is going to be hitting these mountains and where the trees are going to be on these mountains. Okay. Want slightly more density and smaller brush and a kind of medium gray for like some of these larger patches. Not that much smaller though. This exponential little brush grabber right here on this end is fighting me a little bit. And we can just kind of get the general feel. Like you can see we're matching. It'll give the general feel that this is a tree-lined mountain without needing to worry. Because if you actually tried to render every tree over here, it would look terrible. Not only would it, if you actually managed to do it, which would be very hard with the tools, and not just having the ink all blur together, it would still not look very good because it would distract you from the actual focal point, which is this explosion in the middle. And you can tell it's the focal point because all of the clouds even arc around it, and like the tree line arcs down around it to really emphasize it. It is then again, I won't spoil what the explosion is, quote unquote explosion, but it's sort of not the it's the focal point, and so we don't need all of this other stuff to be distracting from it. Right, I'll go a little lighter, a little narrower even, try to get some of these like kind of bright patches that are on here. Get slightly higher density on some of these. Just like a little patch. Then I'll go through and clean, like I'll refine this a little bit with the actual dark tools so that we can use the shadows to give these a little more shape. But it's fairly subtle, just patches of light and dark on here that are really... I've gone a little too broad with the initial sprays I'm seeing, so we'll clean that up a little bit, and then I think this will actually look surprisingly sharp. Let's grab... We'll grab our fun finaliner, but we'll drop the size down a lot. Throw another layer on top of this. And just, it lets us give... I need something with a rougher edge for this. Let's... Maybe the textured pen will do what we're trying. Yeah, I'm gonna do the textured pen, but smaller. Yeah, 200's a little much for that. That'll do for now. We got kind of these paths that arc through and give just like a little bit of sense of depth. You can tell where there's like a patch on the mountain that might be more level and friendly for the trees. It gives them a little space to grow. And then areas that might be a little steeper or rockier. Or perhaps even like a sharp gulch that doesn't have water in it consistently enough to actually grow anything in, and so it leaves this dark scar on the side of the mountain. And likewise, we'll have sort of patches of the lighter white too. And sort of see we get this arc. Ah, okay. We'll talk about that in just a second. I'm going to just kind of hatch my way through this one. Again, that's not the technique that the artist would have used, but we can use it to acquire a somewhat similar effect. Let's see. Once again, having more of these darker, more barren patches on the top. More of the sort of still snowy patches on the bottom. And we can see with this one we've got kind of like a shadowed patch here. And it's just kind of following these blobs of texture a little bit. And most of the lower side of this will get interrupted anyway in just a minute in an interesting way. Because you know how we've talked a few times now about how in this and Witch Had to Tell You both, we often see the artists using pretty bold just like outlines, like actually just outlining the important objects here. And you may not notice it when you're actually reading the manga, but when you look for it, you start to see it everywhere. And in this case, the focal point isn't necessarily a person, because there's nobody in this scene. We can't see anybody. However, depth is really a critical part of this, and so we end up with a very interesting, basically, outline of the closer tree line here, where they've got a dark shadow outline to really make sure they pop against the light of the shadows, or the light of the leaves can really pop against the dark of the mountains behind them. And you sort of see it down here with this one, which I'll just kind of scribble in, because again, it's not the critical focal point here or anything. And we sort of see it with some of these trees that are sneaking their way up the mountain, or the leaves that are obscuring in front of it. I'm not going to worry about that too much either. I do think a little more tact with these, with the airbrush here would probably get us some cleaner results on the mountain itself, like a couple of really big... okay, no, here we go, particle size on a smaller brush. That's too big. Okay, that's useful. That actually gives us kind of the control that we need. Way less density. Still needs to be a fairly big brush, and then just, like, conquer particles. And we can kind of get some of these really bright patches that almost look like... You could, if you were looking for it, this was a place where we expected to see city lights, I would say that they'd be like the more densely populated patches. But in this case, I'm pretty sure it's just a patch of trees that has either caught the light at just the right angle, perhaps their leaves are in season, or just some that still have a little bit of snow on them, perhaps. We get a lot down in sort of this patch. We get kind of these densely sprinkled ones sort of around the bottom. Then we end up with the smaller particle size for the softer grays that kind of come in here. And that would be the tool to do this again if we were doing it a little better. But you can see this is giving it the texture we need fairly well. And then, of course, just because I think it's useful to have, given that it's the focal point, even if I wouldn't normally include it in this sort of background illustration, I am still going to, let's see, let's grab our phenoliner. I'm sure it's fine liner, but I love saying phenoliner, and it's what I've accidentally trained myself to do, so there's no fixing it for me now. Save yourselves. Okay. And this is, once again, I think this is probably, I mean, these could be individual strokes, but they're like either very well-trained and very precise vertical strokes, or they're using a tool sort of like the speed lines here and applying it very cleverly. In either case, I will use the straight line, and I'm just going to keep it to a very fine line. And kind of capture. Whoops. Man, I haven't used the shift and drag to adjust pen size in ages. Wow, that takes me back to when we first started streaming. It's a useful resource to have. Just don't do it much. And we get kind of this tall patch, arcs down a little bit, helps give this a little more vibrancy. But always they're moving inwards, towards the center. Oh, I did it again. It'd be fine if you could use the undo command to fix it, but you can't. It doesn't list as something in the undo to undo, so... Always moving outwards. I realize I kind of whiffed that on one of those. And not all the same length or density. You can see we've got a particularly dark patch here. Perhaps that was... Well, I almost said something that actually was a spoiler, so let's not do that. Then I'll actually do this little part in its own layer too, just because I think we're going to need to illustrate, or not, wow, technically yes, but I'm going to want a lighter patch here where that's the actual base of the explosion, so I just need to kind of fill that in with something real quick. Kind of getting the arc where it's going to expand out into these a little more, and then we'll clean up the underside of them again as we go through and clean up and start on the actual leaf section. And for this one I may actually just use the fine point brush because they're shorter lines and I can make them reasonably believable. These sort of patches. And once again, another burst. Kind of these little burst options here. That's all you really need to catch the sense of everything emanating from this impact central point. Then I can go in there a little bit just to clean up, to make sure you have a clean edge, and fill in anywhere where we really ought to have like actually the darkness and not the brighter edges here. Or at least not the rounded edges. And it's not too much there, really. And then we'll get kind of the edge of the leaves, which I'm just going to sort of rough in here. I'm not even going to worry about the leaf brush. Although the leaf brush would probably have been faster, if I'm honest. One of the benefits of learning those tools. We give it a little better texture. But even just with that, suddenly we have that nice contrast there. We could fill the background with the slightly darker gradient, but again, I'm not too worried about that. What I will try to capture real quick is just a loose sense of these clouds emanating from this central point. Because once again, these are really like the level of detail in the clouds is so much higher than almost everything else in the scene. Almost like photorealistic, which is fascinating. We'll kind of capture some of that. Obviously not these ones around the actual impact here. You can immediately tell that those aren't photorealistic, of course. They're very much like from the source of this. And they're all emanating out from it, however, for two reasons. There's really two benefits of this. One, obviously, it's the focal point of the scene, you know. If everything emanates out from that focal point, then it helps draw your eye towards what everything is coming from. Even if not intentionally, it'll get your eye there. But the other reason is that it actually helps add a little depth too. Having these on all sides of that helps even that fairly cartoony shape here still kind of sit relatively to the ground. Certainly down here we can see it's in front of these distant mountains and behind still fairly distant trees, so we're some distance from it. And being pretty far away from it helps give it a sense of scale. The clouds also do that, and since we can see them on basically every side of it, also contribute to that sense of its rough position. Got a couple of different types, some are wispier than others. Oh yeah, I mean, photography, you're absolutely right. Photography is a wonderful art form all its own. Like, there's a whole beauty there that I have not begun to jump into. But it's a wonderful art form too. A really well thought out photograph. And like, there's actually some pretty transferable skills between sketching and especially the stuff we're talking about today with composition. And then with photography. Do you do photography, Kiwi? Have you jumped into it more? It sounds like you know your stuff with it. Let's see. A loose sense of these. Not just staying equidistant. A few scattered ones. And like, again, I'm not trying to capture the clouds one-to-one. I'm just trying to get the rough sense of them here because they're important for the composition, which is really... Like, we've been looking at technique and style to add the distance and to add the depth, but all of that is part of the overall composition to draw your eye towards this focal central piece here. Which means I'm probably going to end up doing a slight color gradient on the background too, just because that is also contributing. I'm not worrying too much about the light and dark here. Let's see. I will say one thing that is fascinating to me. And when you start really looking at art styles, you'll see it in a lot of manga, and it's again, this is not a criticism. I feel like I always have to preface it with that, though, because a lot of people, I mean, people still take, like, drawing from reference as cheating, which it's definitely not. It's the only way you can learn how to do anything. You're not going to generate every idea in your mind. Like, eventually you'll build up enough knowledge in your head from practicing from reference that you'll be able to draw without it. But you can't just generate all of that stuff in your head. That ain't how... Unless you've got a eidetic memory, and even then, I don't know that it'd let you just immediately render it on the page like that. So, like drawing from reference is an essential skill to practicing. Now, obviously, you don't want to, like, use someone's art as reference and then pass it off as your own, or plug it into a AI generator without their permission and then profit off of it. That would be pretty scummy. But... but it's an important part. Oh, you're going to school for it. Well, awesome. I mean, even if it's just a component of what you're learning, that's really cool. Oh man, yeah. It's something I've dabbled in slightly, but not anywhere enough to have like a worthwhile opinion on it, you know? Let's see. Okay. And then I'm going to throw another layer kind of below this one. Actually, it really ought to be below everything. And just get a very faint... How to do a gradient. Perhaps we ought to mess with one more new tool here. Just do a gradient. Freeform gradient. The lightest shadow. Intrigued with how this is going to work. Yeah, I want pretty strong gap close there. Okay. I'm curious what this is actually affecting, though, because it's not the background. I'm not adding... I think this may actually affect existing things as opposed to... Ah, okay, yep. That... Not that. Let's make it fairly... Ah, yep, no, more this way. Fairly subtle. Ooh. Ah, okay, so then I think I need... I want this to be a lighter gray. If it'll give me an option to adjust that. It's been a long time since I've messed with... Oh, it's just the main drawing color? Okay, then yeah, let's get a much lighter one. Let's go vertically here. And maybe even once more. Started that one too low. I'm gonna let us do kind of this gentle build up. Okay. And then I'm wondering if if I can just erase on this normally. I'm hoping I can, because that would be really... Yes! Okay, yes. Then I'll figure out whatever layer that silliness is on, but that's okay. Let me grab our little fun finna liner. So it's actually probably not the right choice for this particular task. But we can still kind of generally work with it. I wonder what layer that's on. Probably... Oh, okay. Not actually what I expected. There we go. And we can just get a little bit of erasing. And again, what I'm trying to do with this one, with this style especially, because we don't have the digital tools, or at least I don't have the experience with what tools I have and brushes to mimic this one-to-one. Nor would I recommend doing that, because that wouldn't, I mean, might be an interesting way to study it, but when you're looking at something like this, I think you're going to get a lot more out of studying how they're using the tools they have and how you might be able to use your own tools to similar effect. So that's why I'm focusing so much more on composition and on contrasts as opposed to, say, line work and line quality or things like that. Or to matching it one-to-one. Like, I realize our leaf tool isn't the same one that the artist used, and it's not going to get the same effect. But I think we can still get the same general effect, even if it's not the same exact appearance. So that's where I'm kind of trying to focus my energy a little more. Okay, and then on this one, I kind of want a softer eraser, so I'm actually going to go use a soft eraser. Just fairly gentle in here. Catching some of the edge shapes. Just of some of these clouds. I'm just going to scratch them in real quick. That part of the composition is really the more important part. Individual lines and strokes here, not the essential part of this. Certainly worth perhaps studying in your own time, if you really want to jump into matching this exact style. But as far as doing this as a sort of master study, where you're just trying to learn the techniques and learn what makes some of this tick, I think this is probably going to be of more use. Let's see, we'll go on this one, we'll catch the underside of this one. And we get a lot more contrast over in these sections as we get deeper into the gradient once again. Fill in there real quick and easy. Yep, up in that one, a little bit on this. And again, up close, obviously these don't look great. I'm basically just scribbling in lights and shadows. But we're not going to be viewing this up close, and neither is your typical reader for an art piece like this. So this is our focus. Ooh, printing. Ooh, okay. That's a fun medium. Screen printing, especially, I've had a lot of fun with, but it's nasty to it's nasty challenging to be sure, but I find it's a really satisfying one. And then digital printing is a whole separate challenge. Oh man, and like lithography and all that stuff. Ooh, nice. And graphic design is fascinating because it's basically a whole separate medium. Like the way you have to think about it, the techniques you're actually applying, what is good practice in graphic design versus art, totally different, and it's really cool. Oh, well then of course I almost forgot the most important thing. Our focal point needs to also have nice high contrast against this gradient. Now I don't have quite the line density to do this one well, so I'm just going to use our soft eraser still, so that we can kind of get it subtly in between there and not worry too much about the exact precision. but we want to make sure we're not getting any of this shadow on the interior. I'm going to carry it all the way to the top, because that's where our lines would carry it. I'm really just following the lines on that. Okay. Like how to unerase some of that, maybe. Yeah, it was a little too outside the lines. Yeah, but no, I can totally see how that would be a nasty bit of challenge there. But I do love graphic design. It's a whole separate world. There is a different beauty to it that I gotta say is really wonderful once you start to get an eye for it. Okay. Oh, and I didn't even notice there were a couple of very light kind of spackles from the crash, too. I'm not going to worry about the text. I do think it's fun and it adds in this particular scene, but it's not nearly so critical for the composition. Kind of gives a nice arc, once again, arcing around the center point of this, drawing your eye towards it, the mountain sloping down towards the point of impact, the letters arcing over it to kind of signal, once again, it's in the middle. Very cleverly done, but a couple of them even overlapping the explosion itself, which I'm not going to be able to do on layer 8, but I can do on this one. Just get a little bit of debris, and like sure enough, like even our very sloppy, scratchy mountains in here, they still serve the purpose. And we don't even have the front layer in to cover the really nasty, like, lower half of it. So let's do that now. Okay. We're going to grab our leaf tool, we're going to make it nice and big. Well, not too big for the first one. Let's maybe stick to 150 on this. These are going to be fairly distant. And we're going to stick to really light. Really, really light. Second from the top right now. And you'll see we may even have like a few like tiny arcs that are like getting into the valleys and stuff in there, kind of merging up against it. But really, it's mostly just having the leaf patches. And in the distance, there's definitely like kind of the patchiness of the light and dark. Like even getting up right up by the explosion, there's some... That was a little too dense there. A little bit going on there, but more so we're getting along like the edge of the valleys here, covering up on this border. And I'll go through and add some more shadows in a minute here, but a couple of these need to extend across. Even like you could count some of that as part of it. And I'm going to go ahead and just do the very quick fill that we've done, because the reason I do the quick fill, and like I'm basically doing this like hatching where I'm lifting in between each stroke, is so that we can still get some of those like dark textures shining through and we're not just getting full light. But I am going to go in and with a smaller brush size even, go and add a little bit of those counter textures. Okay, not that much smaller. Otherwise we'd lose the leaf pattern entirely. At 50. Let's try 75. There we go. That'll do. That'll do quite nicely. Just a couple in here. Just a couple of patches where we see either a patch that's in shadow, or perhaps the trees just haven't grown in all that well in that spot. Especially in some of these more distant ones, where it's be plausible to have whole swaths that we see that might be different textures and such. I'm going to be very, very light with those. And then... that's really the best way to do it. Given that we don't have a tool that can just do the silhouette of the leaves, or at least I don't have an easy way to do it off the top of my head, I'm going to go in with some larger ones. 50's pretty close to what we've done. Let's go to 300. Get like a larger black kind of silhouettes going in front of it. And again, I don't want these to be too big. Some of these might be a little too big. But we do want them to be noticeably larger than those more distant ones. Once again, I'm just going to kind of fill in. We'll get that texture. Run it right up against the edge of these darker patches. And then I'm going to go slightly smaller and go for our lighter leaves. Just against this. Because this essentially looks like a layer of the woods that's perhaps a little closer to us. And I'm not putting too much thought into where I'm putting these. I'm just generally filling in the patches. I'm trying not to keep one straight line for too long, just casually in there, because we're going to go through one more time even bigger with these up close ones in the corners. And these ones are really big and right up in our face. Because they're much closer to wherever we're viewing from, perhaps on some ridgeline. And the contrast is really high. And that way, with not a whole lot of effort on the actual lettering, or the leafing section, we can capture the depth. We have this sense of, like, even kind of it pouring out of this valley, perhaps, as we get into the smaller, where the leaves go that way. We have the mountains in the background, which, even though they're very sloppy and sketchy, fill the job because our focus is on this kind of higher contrast zone here, and then on the actual explosion itself that it leads up to. The gradient, all of that, all plays together. And it comes together to create a very interesting scene. Now, the one thing I might change, if I have the option, is we went for a slightly more muted gray for our backgrounds, other than that first mountain, and let me see if I can just do a quick little... Yeah, there we go. Now it blends better. Even though it's completely different sketch style, it still blends okay. Oh, offset printing is fun. Yeah, oh man. Printing is like, there's so many categories that fall into it. I feel like people don't think about it enough when they're thinking about art forms, but there's so much there. The historian in me loves, of course, the printing press and letter and offset printing. But then, like, I don't know, the art nerd in me, I was always a fan of screen printing. You can just do fun stuff with screen printing. Okay. Wow, holy cow, we've been here an hour and a half nearly? Okay. Then let's take a pause. I think we've looked at these techniques pretty thoroughly. We've been able to replicate this scene. Again, like, I'm not going to pretend that that was clean work. I was, like, messing around with the tools. I adjusted the brush size and ran over it a couple times on the mountains, trying to get the stippling right and the sort of speckles. These are just real quick and sloppy lines. And yet, here we are. I realize y'all probably can't see it super well there. Here we are. I need a reference image that fits in the screen better. We got kind of the layers of the trees. I realize a lot of this one may not have been visible during this. Man, I need to place this reference image better. We'll do that for the next ones, because when we come back from break, we're going to look at some actual images. Some actual forest scenes, or at least one of them, given we don't have a ton of time here. And we're going to see if we can't use these techniques to either capture the scenes as they are, or to give them a specific focal point, and like actually try to draw the viewer in a certain direction. But that'll be in a few minutes. In the meantime, it's a good chance to stand up, stretch a little bit, check your posture, use the restroom, drink some water, all that jazz. And I'll be back in just a few. See y'all on the flip side. Howdys and salutations, y'all. We are back at it. This time picking up a reference. Hopefully we've got the reference a little bit smaller so it's not blocking the screen. That is my bad. Sorry about that. Whoops, let's not move everything. I do wish that it would actually let me move the thing I selected. There we go. Having some issues with OBS on that lately. I'm sure it's a me issue. Like, OBS is fine. But let's take a look at this one. Let's go ahead and make a new scene, basically. We'll just hide those away. Create a brand new little thing here. And I'm going to work from the background to the foreground on this one, focusing again on the stuff that we have been focusing on, so composition and level of detail especially. So let's... I realize our scene's a square here, so we're not going to match it one-to-one. I'll do like a tiny little bit of very loose layout here real quick. Because we're going to have our hill, basically. Our main sort of focal point hill. Going to have its kind of angled slope, and then it angles it arcs back down a little bit, basically. Got a nice little, like, veil up there. And then down here we've got an opening in the trees, caused by who knows what. Perhaps logging, perhaps there's like a river or something there, or like there was a landslide some time ago. Could be anything. Almost kind of looks like it has a face to it from the arc of some of these edges. It's fun. Okay. Then we also know that in the background we have sort of a series of receding hills, almost receding into each other. Oh, and we can even see what I was talking about, where the more distant ones are a little bit lighter and a little bit bluer because they're considerably further away. But they also kind of repeat the same shape as this hill of these low, flat, with occasional like grassy patches visible in the top. I'm not going to worry too much about catching many of these details. Could be a road, could be a landslide in there, really. But just kind of catching that they're there. And then... a little bit of texture on this actual hill too, which is a little closer. A lot closer. It's probably the one we're looking at for the most part. And then of course we have the clouds, which I think we'll try to use clever brushwork to get those working. There we go. We've got it kind of outlined. So let's work our way back to front. And I think that really does mean clouds first. Especially... I'm actually going to grab the fill, and I'm going to grab our second to brightest here. And, yeah, that'll do. Actually, let's go third to brightest. I need a little bit of contrast there. Wow, it's amazing how much more different those look than they do up here. There we go. That's a better view for that. Yeah, sure enough. There we go. Okay. So we got that. We've got this one. We know our general value for it. Probably ought to plan the value on these things a little more in general, but that's okay. Because in this case, let's go to our texture brush here. And I'm not even going to worry too much about getting anything exactly. We've got a cloud one, but I suspect it's not going to be quite what we're looking for. Yeah, it's kind of just the puffy, fluffy. We could make it work. But I'm actually kind of inclined to stick with our leaf brush here for some of the colors that it provides. But we're going to want to be much smaller. This time we don't want the leaf detail actually standing out. So maybe like a 200, and I'm going to go with much denser. And we'll just kind of catch some of these floating forms up here. Almost like a whale shape on a lot of these. Very interesting shapes to the clouds. Kind of like inverted trapezoid overlapping on each other. And they've got a little bit of texture to them, like they're not all just rectangles. But I'm going to try to just block in the general shapes for these. Because again, this sort of, the goal of this background art style, as far as I can tell, is heavily to kind of capture the feel of the background. We're not trying to capture every little detail. We're just trying to capture. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this whole section in, and then we'll use shadows to give it a little more depth in a minute here. Same with this one. We'll have like a little bump there, the ridge. And we'll even have some coming down here. And again, we'll overlap it with the mountains. We'll take a more Bob Rossi approach where we can just do the layers, you know? It's not that critical that everything be exactly right. We'll be coming back on it again and again. Because now I want to grab a slightly darker here. And this is where I'm going to start trying to give these like just a little bit of shape to them. Not a ton. I don't want anything that looks too much like an actual pen stroke, or else it's going to be fairly jarring. Even this is probably a little too much contrast. We'll get kind of... Yeah, to make this like a little smaller even. Gives me a little more control over some of the shapes here. Just like a little faint bit on that one, really. And then in here we actually have a lot going on with the shadows, even though the silhouette isn't particularly bold. You can just kind of fill those in. Let's see. More happening here. Still some lighter patches, of course, but there's also fairly deep shadows on some of these. They're there. We've got a little patch here. And always focusing, because these shadows are going to be landing primarily on the underside of the clouds. And while some of them we can see, like this one, just because of the angle, are going to be lighter or darker in what's visible, generally speaking, we want to make sure that if we're not following our reference exactly and we're just winging it, we're getting these shadows on the lower edge. In this case, that sort of ties into that one, gives it a little form. And we've got this one where you can see more of the bottom, and so we see more of its shape down there. And like, again, very basic. We probably want to add like a little bit of gradient or stippling in some of these spots to give it a little more texture and break up the kind of line edges that we're seeing here. But we're not going to start with that. Instead, we're going to go ahead and jump on and start working on these. These are already going to be going much, much lower in our values. Not all of them, mind, but most of them. And like texture-wise, they're going to stay very basic. I may even just use the tree texture and make it tiny. Because, I mean, technically it's the right texture, but... And we may as well use the tools we have. But really, like, we're not going to be making out individual trees on any of this. We're just going to, like, especially this distant one here, we just need, like, any rough textured pen would do. Like, I'm using the tree brush here, but we could probably just use the, like, actual rough texture brush, and it would get us as good of a result. Because it's so distant. Putting the tree brush is a little silly. Like, we could literally, what's the roughest one that we've got? I don't have a lot of rough ones, which is part of why I went for the tree brush. But even like the texture pen would probably get us a fairly similar, if slightly darker, result. But I like the tree brush a little more. It technically fits a little better, and it's giving us kind of that light and dark interplay, which is nice. There's that one, which really probably ought to have been a little lighter. That's okay. I'll use the texture brush to do a lot of the fill-in, though. No problems with that. We'll just fill on down to the next one. Heck, I could even use the fill tool to make this a little lighter. With, obviously, some consequences. But that's okay. And we'll just keep using this one. I mean... it feels silly to just use the brushes and be like, ah, yes, we're matching the style. But again, the point of this is not a one-to-one style match. In this case, it's a, how do you get these effects to come together? And even using pretty basic tools, I mean, this is not how the tree brush was intended. Like, I feel like that's not quite how it was supposed to be used. Go back to the smaller size for a little bit. Drop it down, well, not that far, but like down to a 20. Slightly, well, we can actually stick with the darker edge based on the reference. And just kind of roughen up the edge on this a little bit where it'll be visible. Then we can leap into a slightly darker one for this next patch and a slightly bigger brush size. Because again, it's still way off in the distance. So we're not really going to be making out a ton of individual trees, but we'll be able to see like patches where there might be some taller or shorter trees a little bit better. So having that there will help. and having these to kind of bound this so we get the right texture on the edge of it. Even though, I mean, like, obviously this is just silly. Getting kind of the edge there, the edge of this one a little bit more where it's darker. And then in between those, actually, like these ones, they ought to be getting the darker trees, so I will go for that. A little bit darker on that rim too, getting the depth. But then beyond that, like, yeah, it doesn't... Like, I can try to fill in with this one and it'll give us texture, kind of. But, like, at this point, this is not terribly different from just using a texture or stippling brush. I'm just using this because it's convenient, basically. Build in. You have to be careful with this, however, partly because this is one of those tools where we're still getting slightly different shades based on the angle and strength of pressing it, and because you don't want to get consistent stroke directions in here. We have to be a little careful about that. The sort of scribble in method is all fun and games until you're like, whoops, my mountain may as well have been painted with a crayon. I'm going to at least do 2 directions of hatching there. Okay, we've got that. We'll deal with that little one there later. And then we're starting to get towards the actual mountain here a little more. Where we might actually notice some tree textures, and I'm actually going to move to the leaves because we're getting close enough that we're not caring about the silhouettes of the trees so much as the leaves themselves, but these are still quite small, quite distant, and a little bit patchy. I may actually go back into this one, and the color jitter, I'm going to turn it on. We don't need a ton of it, but it's a little bit patchy here. Okay, we can go less dense too. Color jitter's not doing us a ton of good if we're just like kind of... Yeah, I still don't like the color jitter approach to this. I think it'd be better if we just had slightly finer control on it. I'm just going to kind of like do that to get a little texture in there. But then I'm going to go through and actually do a non-color jitter on top. Loosely. We'll still use the texture on the bottom. But, yeah. You can kind of tell, like, there's areas where we've got this, like, a little more. It's just getting the layers. Might have some that are a little lighter than darker section, but, like, kind of trying to get a more randomized feel in here, which the color jitter couldn't do, but me attempting to simulate random is also not going to do amazingly well either. Oh boy. Should have just gone with like really low density one color and been done with it. There we go. That's better. And I'll do the other color just kind of on top of it. Now we get our little bit of texture. We have our edge. Okay, good enough. I will say I'm looking forward to the character style study a lot more. I feel like there's more interesting stuff that we can do with that one. Our clouds also are way too high of contrast. I'm gonna use the fill tool on those, and well, I'm not gonna wait. Let's grab this. Did we run out? Where did the music go? I got signed out of Spotify? Go to your browser to log in. No, we are not doing that on stream. Oh my word. Okay, well, guess it'll be a quiet stream from the rest here. I have never had that happen in well over a year of streaming now. What on earth? Well, we'll just have to make do with the tones of my voice for now, which... Sorry. Oh, jeepers, that's gonna leave some rough... Not even anti-aliasing, it's just, borders. Where it's not quite filling smoothly, but that's okay. I'm actually gonna go even lighter with the sky itself. Well, no, the sky has a little more contrast. Well, we can leave it like that. At least this way the clouds aren't dominating the contrast game anymore. And now, I shouldn't have done that on this layer, but that's okay. Once again, this is an exercise. This isn't even... yeah. I'm glad you didn't notice, at least. I may have it turned up louder for myself than I do on the stream. But yeah, okay, let's see. But yeah. Oh, right. Talking about exercises versus finished pieces. Obviously, none of the stuff that I'm working on today is like a finished piece that I would post as, like, oh, look at this, a completed work. Like, these are exercises. These are little studies. They're fun to do. You can still get some cool looking stuff out of them. I'm going to call this one, apparently, test from ref. Also, where did all of the image go? There we go. Okay. And I think they're still interesting, but like they're not stuff that we're going to be submitting as a finished piece to a contest or anything like that. It's important to do exercises like this sometimes, especially like for style studies. If you approach them trying to make a finished piece, you're going to stress yourself out a lot because you're not going to match the style of the original artist exactly. Nor should you, frankly. It's not really a good use of your time or theirs. Okay, let's see. Leaves. Yeah, okay, I know what we're going to do with these. Cool. Unless I've scrolled too far in. We can still do some cool stuff with these. Okay, so brush size, 100 is still very small. We're going to jump up to 200 for this one now. And keeping in mind, distant ones are a little bit darker, but we may have to manually add some texture and shading to this. This is where the interpretation part kind of comes in, which is, frankly, a lot of the fun. All right, let's get ourselves going on this layer. Oops, okay, so that's basically just our background color, which might actually be a good... Well, even this isn't going to show the texture super well. Okay. For the purposes of learning this, let's get something a little bit darker. There we go. Okay, so that's that's a reasonable brush size for these further ones. I'm going to keep it more dense because we don't really want to be making out the individual leaves. We just want to be catching sort of the shape and size of them over there. And then once again, I'm going to go in with some just slightly darker. We don't need a ton of contrast, but just a little bit, especially along this sort of ridge line here. Then we'll go back in with the lighter ones because we do want the lighter ones to be sort of on top. But this way we can get a little bit of texture there. We'll go in with some really dark ones happening in here. And we definitely want to keep some of the leaf texture, but I'm going to worry more about that on our second pass, which is with the lighter once again. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and kind of catch this. Yeah, this may be a little too uniform to be doing in a terribly interesting way, which is where we're going to take some artistic liberties, make sure we get the leaves actually showing and like pinching in on this darkness in the background. We'll take some liberties, because I'm going to go ahead and fill in most of the patch here, at least this top part, until we're getting to about this section. I don't really want to get line directions here, so I'm going to kind of swirl this in. We'll get a slightly darker with just a hint of much darker right towards the top. I'm just kind of going to blast in here because we will give it shape, once again, using these lighter ones. And allowing ourselves to flex around it a little bit, let it kind of smooth in naturally. There we go. Much like we'll do sort of around this kind of grassy plain up here with some of the stuff in the background. But then, like most of this, like we're getting a little bit of texture from here, but most of this isn't going to really show through. We're just filling in right now. However, down here is where it'll get a little bit interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, as we're getting towards the parts of the hill that are closer to us, I'm going to start moving up to a slightly larger brush. See. And secondly, we're going to focus on layers a little bit more. So we've done some of these patches with the slightly darker. I'm going to catch a few with the slightly lighter as well. Just a few patches here, and we'll probably cover most of this up. We haven't really given a specific composition to the piece, so I'm not going to worry about aiming the viewer's eye particularly at this point. But let's just try to give a few patches of texture in here. And you'll find this oftentimes doing layering. You can even use the most basic shape pens, and layering them over each other like this will give you a lot to work with. Whereas, like, because it can feel like when you've got just like a hard round edge brush, like something, well, not even the G pen, it's got a nice tapered edge, but like the Millipen here, like, yeah, it can feel like there's limits to what you can do with this. But if you just take, like, even just erasing with it, you can make it pretty sharp and tapered. I mean, you wouldn't think that was a Millipen stroke right there. You can give it a lot of texture. There's a lot of options you can do with this sort of layering and cutting into your previous strokes. And it's especially useful on these sort of, texture moments like this. But we still have to remember some of the other principles. For example, not neglecting our border boundaries. You see, once again, it's easy when you're texturing or filling in to sort of leave out any of those areas that seem to be right up near the edges, because you're like, oh, you know, that's already got some detail, or you don't want to mess up your border. There's a number of reasons, and that goes for interior borders here too. I need some of these lighter ones right up on the edge of these. If anything, it'll give it a little more contrast, but also it makes it look more natural, because nature doesn't care. I'm going to just once again kind of patch these out a little bit more, make them less dense. I'm just tapping my pen on these ones now, so I'm not even doing full strokes, just to kind of break it up a little bit. Get our layering going in here. Then as we get towards some of the closer ones, I'm going to focus on sort of the density of the lightness and darkness. For example, I'm going to go with less of the light down in this edge. We sort of see, again, this is a pretty flat lighting image, but we can see patches of different types of trees. So we've got some areas that are going to have higher density and some that are going to have lower density. So I'll try to cover up more on the lower density of the light trees, kind of imply some slopes with that potentially. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead and start moving up to a larger brush size so that the actual texture we're getting here is also appearing to be a little closer, even though for the most part we're not going to see a lot of it. Because again, this first pass especially is mostly going to get buried. Especially the stuff around that gap there. At this point I'm just trying to fill in, so we've kind of got the value. And I am trying to give this, it's got a little bit of a face in the original image, I'm just leaning into it more. Let's take a moment to zoom in on this crevice here, because we got the tree shapes. And there's a couple of ways we could simulate these. But what I'm going to go for is actually getting some much lighter shapes in here for this kind of grassy field that we have. And then I'm going to go for a much smaller brush for a few moments to get the really dark shadows in here. Because these shadows are following, they're kind of long and extended and perhaps a little bit ominous or off-putting even just from the individual tree trunks, but they've still got the shapes. The overall shape of it is still following the kind of tree patterns, like the tall and skinny. But we'll kind of catch some of this, some of the patchiness of it, filling in. And then, of course, I'm going to go in for a lot more of that up here, so we'll kind of have the depth behind the trees. We've kind of got our shadows here. And then this, I'm going to go for, once again, our sort of main middle tone that we've been using here. And we'll have some of these tall parts near where a large shadow is happening, and then like just the various kind of in terrain. And we'll go back towards a larger brush for some of this, so that we're getting more of the leaf feel. But interspersed with perhaps some of the smaller ones, just to get a little bit less of overly defined texture in there. We can even have a little bit coming up from below. Not gonna have too much up there, but like a little more there. Smaller. And I am just kind of feeling this out a little bit. I think we need some of like a middle tone in here too to add a little bit of kind of the in-between light that we're getting perhaps from some of the tree trunks themselves. But the main thing is that we want the high detail leaves to be, the larger leaves especially, to be coming up from this lower side, so that we're kind of getting the sense that we're seeing into the clearing here. Really should probably have used smaller brushes in some of that. That's okay. And we'll, once again, leaning into our larger brushes here, going to do more of our texturing, especially in this particularly bright patch, which I might even have like a little more on. And by a little more, I mean like even some especially lighter pieces. And then I'll go back in with our kind of main flat brush, maybe a little bit smaller, to cover up most of these segments here. We're getting kind of this texture. Now, this would be better if we had a stronger composition. Once again, this style is really designed to help emphasize composition in this particular illustration. If we'd had more time left, what I'd really recommend is this one would be an excellent piece to try to focus on. Lots of interesting lighting and shadows, lots of depth that we could lean into. Perhaps something to try on the free time. And see how that goes. But this one's a fairly flat illustration other than the depth in the back, which I think we were able to cover quite well. So I'm going to kind of just cut my losses here for the most part. Not amazing. Too much like a face. But I think being able to apply some of that, testing out this different texture, focusing on not having the clouds stand out over much. If anything, we just don't have quite enough contrast between this mountain and the background, which could be solvable, but it's going to mess with some of our textures. Yeah, see, because now the contrast on most of our textures is a little too high. So we'd have to go back in and like kind of try to fill some of these in, which we're going to accidentally hit the background and then just send it right back to where it was. So, stuff to tweak, stuff to adjust, but that's part of why it's worth setting up your value palette from the get-go. However, I do still think this was a useful application, especially with some of the background ones we're looking at, the nice contrast that's actually drawing nice attention back here. The reasonable level of detail, this little tree brush looks kind of silly if we get too close up to it, but we don't need to. And we don't even need to be able to make out the individual trees to still get the nice texture happening up at the top and along these edges here, the nice depth. Working from back to front is still a good approach, even if applied here it wasn't the strongest, just because we've got a very flat color happening here. And this style isn't necessarily going to try to capture all of the color variance that's happening in the individual trees. So all in all, interesting application, probably not as strong as some of our past ones, but I think that's okay. Because next time, we're going to be focusing on the characters. Of course, it's always worth, if you're not happy with how applying it goes once, do it again, try a different image. Like I said, like if we had more time, this one has an interesting composition angled towards a specific upwards focal point, and this one has an interesting composition that's, whether intentional or not, and I think it is intentional by the photographer, it really is bringing our view right to this nice, beautifully highlighted little home in the bottom left here. It fits the rule of thirds nicely, the lighting makes it much brighter than its surrounding territory, and many of the various lines of both the shadows and the mountains are directing the eye towards it. So it's a really nicely composed image, and it'd be a really nice one to do a study on. So that may be something worth doing. Like this one, it's okay. We learned some stuff. The results aren't great. It's a nice exercise, but we're done with it. But I think that we could apply and do even stronger on the next one. And that's a good thing to keep in mind with most art pieces, really. I mean, unless it's a commission or something and you have to finish it and like actually have a nice polished thing, of course. But especially for exercises and even for just like general art pieces, is not worrying too much about it being perfect, just focusing on what you can learn from it to make the next one better. And even if the next one's worse, the one after it might get better. Like it's not a direct upward staircase. It's more of a general average upward trends with art. But that's going to be it for us tonight. Once again, no raids. Unfortunately, I just don't have anything lined up for it. I can do a quick look to see if anyone's online, actually, before I fully call that. I'm going to have to open up Twitch. I don't know if I use Stream Elements, and I don't know if there's a way to raid from it, but I haven't found one. Okay, yeah, everyone who I would normally raid to, Dex isn't on, Galactic isn't on, Lilith that I found yesterday isn't on. Uh, yeah, and raiding the stop sign camera is funny, but it's not particularly useful. It's not good for building the stream, it's not good for building a community, because it's just the stop sign camera. Worth checking out if you ever want to look up stop sign cam on Twitch, but it's not really an interesting art one. So I think that we'll probably leave it here for now. Thank you all for dropping in. Thank you, Kiwi, for sticking around for a while. It was great to see you. And I will let y'all get back to it. I hope that whenever it is for you, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or night, that it's a wonderful time. And I hope that you're not as thrown off by the lack of music as I still am. It's really jarring to me. I'm kind of surprised how much. I like my music. But whenever I do see you again, we'll have plenty of music to go around. And I hope in the meantime that y'all have a wonderful one. And I'll see y'all on the flip side. So have a good night.